We've been discussing what we have been calling the age of industry, right? We've been talking about the growth of manufacturing companies and factories and people moving from the farms into the cities because of the increase of factory work and the immigration sort of skyrocketing, and then the idea of these modern cities growing, and then the problems and the benefits that come from these cities growing. At the same time, we have all of these politics that sort of pop up. And so we're going to spend a few minutes talking about a couple of things I want us to look at. And then you guys are going to do a little bit of minor research on a couple of presidents during this time period. But I want to lecture on a couple of quick things first. Let's talk about farmers during this time period. We have this era, the issues of the nation's currency system becomes forefront in the minds of the American farmers. A couple of things begin to sort of feed into this. Number one, we have the Great Plains being settled. So this whole area of the United States, big open fields, very fertile and able to grow large amounts of crops. We have this new machinery being invented and being manufactured and available to regular farmers. New technology is coming out, new ways to plant your seeds, new ways to feed your crops, new ways to harvest your crops. And these farmers experienced this massive amount of increased production, which is good. But the problem was this new type of farming required large investments of capital. Farmers are having to purchase the new machinery. They're having to purchase other manufactured goods to run these farms. Shipping produce, especially from the Great Plains, becomes very expensive to ship. And then after the Civil War, the price of crops plummets, which makes sense if you just sort of think for a second about this supply and demand system. Supply and demand says that the more of something that there is, the less valuable it becomes, and the less of something that there is, the more valuable it becomes. If there were, 6 million copies of Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh, it wouldn't be worth very much. But since there's, one original, it becomes highly valuable. And so during the Civil War, the men are off fighting. Fewer and fewer farms are producing these crops, and therefore, because there's less of the product, the price skyrockets. Then the men come home, more farms are being settled, more crops are being produced, and the price that they can sell things for begins to plummet. And so during this time period, farmers are having to borrow large amounts of money, and therefore they become very active in political affairs. So out of this, we have this thing called the Grange come into play. And the Grange is just a national association of farmers. It's actually called the Patrons of Husbandry. And husbandry was just the idea of farming your land and working your land. They call it the Grange. This association grew really, really quickly. By 1875, there are somewhere around 20,000 local Grange organizations, about 1.5 million members. They are this group is founded for social and cultural activities. Basically, the Grange gave farmers a chance to discuss their problems and began to be able to work together, kind of like the unions that we talked about last week. They began to influence state legislatures to adopt a legislation that was financially beneficial to farmers. When the best known Granger Law, one of them they called the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, which began to regulate railroad freight rates. Anyway, they begin to work together to better the farming association. They formed what we call co-ops or cooperatives. And basically a co-op or a cooperative is a business operated for the benefit of its members. So a co-op comes together, they pay a fee, and the whole purpose is to work together. It saves its members money. They don't really make a profit, but if there are profits that are made, they're shared by the members. Basically, a farming co-op would come together, they would bring all of their produce, and they would equally share these things. This the Grange cooperatives often sold their produce and purchased farm supplies, and then they would provide financially to those who were needing the help. After the Civil War, farmers wanted the federal government to increase the amount of money in circulation. So after the Civil War, like I told you a few minutes ago, the price of produce, or price of crops began to plummet. These farmers are needing more and more money, so they decided that the answer would be for the government to put more money into, just print more money. The process in which the supply of money is increased, here's what happens. As the supply of money is increased, the value of the dollar declines, and therefore prices go up, and this is called inflation. And so I'm trying to, in my brain, this makes sense on one level, and another level it doesn't make sense, because on the level of selling my crops, if the value of a dollar decreases, then I have to raise my prices, and therefore the farmers would make more money. On the flip side of that, as they're purchasing things in my brain, the price of what they're going to have to purchase is going to go up as well. So I'm not exactly sure what the benefits of inflation were, but what I've read is that farmers favored inflation at this time because raising farm prices would increase their income, and the cheaper money, which is just the money that has declined in value, would make it easier for them to pay off their loans they had taken out when the value of the dollar was greater. The problem is, from my perspective, is they didn't really look far enough ahead to see that on the other side of this, their costs are going to increase as well. They were very desperate, and they were just trying to dig their way out of a sinking ship, to be honest. So of course they're looking for the right now and not the long term. And like I just said, inflation is the process in which the supply of money is increased, and thus the value of the dollar decreases. And the reality is we see inflation around the United States a lot. We're going to talk about it over and over in history. And it's one of those kind of hot topics that is still kind of a hot topic right now, with free money being passed out. Now, at this time period, we have this thing called the greenback issue. The preference of farmers for cheap money became clear when Congress announced its intention to withdraw from circulation greenbacks it had issued during the Civil War. Now, here's the thing: if you have not had U.S. History 1, and even if you had, you probably aren't going to remember this. During the Civil War, they began to print money that had not been backed by any gold or any other valuable metal. No gold, no silver, no nothing. They were just dollars printed, basically backed by governmental credit. And the problem is that this money now has no backing, and therefore it has no value. And so what they began, they called them greenbacks because that's really all they were. They were just printed money with no actual value behind them. So withdrawing the greenbacks would decrease the money supply, therefore increasing the value of each dollar in circulation. And so then we have this collision because we have a whole group of people wanting more money to be printed, and you have the Congress who is trying to take money that is in circulation out, and they are totally opposite sides of the spectrum. And what we end up with is a whole new political party called the Greenback Labor Party, which advocated, which means that they promoted or they wanted the federal government to increase the number of greenbacks in circulation. And we have by Congress 1878, after winning 14 seats in Congress, the Greenback Party persuaded Congress to stop the withdrawal of the greenback. So they really became a very powerful group of people. They won, like I just said, 14 seats in Congress, and they were able to sort of overturn this idea of taking out the greenbacks, which then, of course, changed the whole inflation system, and it gets kind of messy and sticky. All right, so the Republican Party, like I said at the very beginning, they were dominant throughout this time period. A Republican president occupied the White House for all but 2 terms from 1861 to 1912. So you guys are going to just take some time, use your cell phones, use your computers, use whatever you need to fill in the next several presidents you have on your note sheet. You're going to have to look that information up. Don't spend 1,600 hours looking for this information. Google it. I don't even care if you pull it from Wikipedia. The reality is Wikipedia is probably a pretty reliable source, as many fact checkers as they have. So fill that out, answer the questions, and that's it for history this week.